If you're waiting for the perfect moment, then watch this video. Because what you're about to hear might feel uncomfortably familiar, like something you've already thought about many times but never fully faced. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from action, but from constant postponement. It's not the exhaustion of doing too much, but the quiet fatigue of always being about to start, always preparing, always adjusting, always believing that a slightly better version of the current moment is just around the corner. At first, it doesn't feel like a problem. In fact, it feels intelligent, responsible even. You tell yourself that you're not rushing into things blindly. You're being careful. You're waiting for clarity, for structure, for motivation, for the right internal state where everything will finally align and starting will feel natural. And because of that belief, waiting feels justified. So you wait. You wait for a version of yourself that feels more stable than the current one. A version that is more disciplined, more focused, more confident. A version that wakes up one morning and finally says, "Now I'm ready." And in your mind, that version is not fictional. It feels real, almost reachable, like it exists just slightly ahead of you in time. But what starts as patience slowly becomes something else. Time begins to lose its structure. Days stop feeling like separate units. Weeks blend together without clear milestones. Months pass, and you can still clearly remember the intention you had at the beginning, but the action attached to it has not moved forward. And here is where something subtle happens that most people don't notice. You start living in the idea of progress, instead of progress itself. You think about what you will do. You plan how you will do it. You imagine different versions of yourself doing it. But your actual life remains untouched by all of that internal activity. It creates a strange illusion where it feels like something is happening, when in reality, nothing external is changing. At some point, this pattern becomes so familiar that you stop questioning it. Instead, you build a story around it. You begin to believe that this is just how you operate, that you need the right moment in order to function properly, that your best work only happens under specific internal conditions that you don't currently have. And that belief is very comforting because it removes pressure. If the moment isn't right, then the delay is not your fault. But there is a hidden cost to this comfort. Because while you are waiting for ideal conditions, you are also training yourself to only act when things feel easy. And life, as it turns out, rarely becomes easy on demand. What makes this even more complicated is that nothing in your environment is stopping you. There is no external barrier strong enough to fully explain the delay. You are still capable. You still understand what needs to be done. You still think about it clearly. And yet, something invisible keeps you in the same place. And that's where the uncomfortable question begins to form. What if the right moment is not something you find, but something you manufacture through action? Because if that is true, then waiting is no longer neutral. It becomes active avoidance. And most people don't like seeing it that way because it changes the emotional meaning of their delay. It stops being patience and starts looking like hesitation. It stops being planning and starts looking like avoidance of discomfort. And discomfort is really what this is about. Not physical discomfort, but the internal friction of beginning something where the outcome is uncertain. Because once you start, something irreversible happens. You become visible to yourself in a new way. Your effort becomes measurable. Your limitations become exposed. And the fantasy version of potential begins to collapse into something more real, more grounded, and sometimes more disappointing. As long as you don't start, everything remains perfect in theory. Nothing has been tested, nothing has been judged, nothing has been failed, and that protects a very fragile sense of possibility. So the mind adapts. It creates logic around delay. It generates reasons that feel rational enough to believe in. I need more time. I need better conditions. I need to feel more ready. And each of these statements feels true in isolation, but together they form a pattern that quietly keeps you still. And the strange part is that from the outside, this doesn't look like inaction. It looks like thoughtfulness, like caution, like someone who is being deliberate about their life choices. But internally, it often feels very different. There is usually a background tension that never fully disappears, a sense that something is always slightly unfinished, a recurring thought that you've already had this realization before, but nothing changed after it. A loop of awareness without transition into action. I'll start soon, but soon keeps moving. And over time, something more subtle develops. Your identity begins to shift around this pattern. You become someone who is in preparation, someone who is getting ready, someone who is always close to beginning something important, but never crossing the threshold. And this identity can last surprisingly long without breaking, because it still feels like progress internally. There is movement in thought. There is engagement in planning. There is emotional involvement in the idea of change. But externally, your life remains in a holding pattern. At some point, even the original goal starts to blur. You may no longer clearly remember the exact moment you decided to start. The perfect moment is no longer a specific point in time. It becomes a vague emotional condition that never fully arrives. And this is where the loop becomes most visible. Because the truth is, readiness was never a prerequisite for action. It was something that you were expecting to appear first, but in reality, it is something that only develops after action begins, not before. So, the system you've been relying on contains a contradiction. You are waiting for readiness to start, but readiness is waiting for you to start. And that creates a loop that has no natural exit as long as you stay inside it. Until one day, usually not as a breakthrough, but as a quiet observation, you notice something simple. Time is still moving, life is still progressing, and your internal state is still waiting for the same condition it has been waiting for all along. And that is usually where the real shift begins. Not in motivation, not in clarity, but in a question that feels different from all the previous ones. What am I actually protecting myself from by not starting? Because once that question becomes real, the idea of the perfect moment stops functioning as a destination. It stops being something ahead of you. It becomes something you've been using to avoid a decision that has been available all along. That you don't need the perfect moment. You need the willingness to begin without one.